So tonight we are talking about waking up the weakest muscles. Can we wake them up? What would stop us being able to, and how are we going to do it? Now, we can't talk about muscles without knowing a little bit about them first. So I want to go right back to the beginning and talk about muscles. There are three different types of muscle. There's skeletal muscle, which is basically the muscle that moves your body. There's smooth muscle, which is any tube inside your body, and that includes your blood vessels, your big blood vessels, things in your digestive, your gut, renal system. Anything that looks like a tube has muscles in because it contracts to move stuff up and down the tube. And the third type of muscle is cardiac muscle. And obviously we are not talking about smooth muscle, and we're not talking about cardiac muscle, although exercise is always good for your cardiac muscle. So that's your actual heart muscle, not the blood supply to your heart muscle, which is different, and that would be smooth muscle. So we're talking about skeletal muscles, and how many are there? There's a bit of an argument about how many there are. The estimates are between 650 and 840, and that's quite a difference. And the reason there is so much discrepancy is, say, biceps in your arm is made of two pieces, and some people count that as one muscle and some people count it as two. And then your quadriceps in your knee, by the name of it, it is four parts, and some people call it four muscles, some people call it one. So this is why the discrepancy. But let's say somewhere in the middle is around 700 muscles in the body. That's a lot of muscles. We're not going to wake them all up, and even if we did, they wouldn't all be very useful and do any work. And there will be people among you in the audience, and parents of people and carers of people, spouses of people, who say there are muscles that'll never wake up. And up to a point, that's true. And people say, oh, I'm far too weak to do any exercise. No such thing. If you can open your eyelids, you're moving your muscles. If you can move your tongue and talk, you are using muscle. So most muscles have the ability to be switched on, even if it's only artificially. But that doesn't explain why they get so weak in the first place, and also how we reverse that. So we know in spinal muscular atrophy, the main cause of weakness is lack of nerve impulses to the muscle itself. And the more severe your disease, the less nerve impulses. And the way I always describe it is like a dimmer switch on a light. The lower it's turned down, the less light you get, so that the type 3s have the dimmer switch switched up pretty high, and the type 1s have it switched down pretty low. And the whole idea of the new medication is to get that switch turned up and give you more power by sending more impulses and things to the muscles. So we know that these drugs are helping. They're helping a lot of people. A lot of adults are going to be able to access these drugs. Well, hopefully a lot of adults are going to be able to access these drugs, and also our type 3s. But starting before you access, or even starting for no other reason than doing physio, is a good place to start. So we know that the muscles are weak. Which muscles do we want to wake up? Do we want to wake all of them up? No, that's unreasonable. If you're a type 2, I mean, we're not suddenly going to wake up muscles and get you up and walking, particularly not if you're an adult and you haven't stood for years, because ultimately none of these treatments cure contractures or reverse scoliosis. If you've ever had spinal surgery, your spine's fixed. If you've got contractures, we're not going to get rid of them. We could consider surgery for some of the children to help improve the range for the muscles to work over. But if you are completely fixed, if you are stuck, if your arm is stuck in the bent position and the muscle here wants to pull, or more to the point, the muscle at the back wants to try and straighten your arm, if that movement is not there, we're never ever going to be able to switch that muscle on enough to overcome the contractures. Now, contractures can be stretched, we know that, but not if they've been there for years and years and years. We're not suddenly going to make a big difference to contractures that have been there an incredible length of time. And particularly if those contractures, if you are an adult, if those contractures were there and fixed before when you were a child. Now, if you still have children and they are still growing, you can prevent those contractures getting worse, because one of the main reasons contractures get worse is that the bones grow, the muscles don't stretch, and the only thing that can happen is the joints bend to take up the tightness of the muscle. So if you still have children, if they haven't stopped growing, then yes, we can prevent contractures getting tighter. But if you are an adult and have had tight hips for years, suddenly switching on your hip extensors is not going to make a big difference. So we've got to be sensible about what we want to achieve. We have to think of everybody. Everybody's needs are different. And when I say, you know, it's not worth switching on that muscle, that might be for a type 2 who's not stood for 20, 30 years, but they may not be relevant to a type 3 who has stood within the last couple of years. So it has to be about each individual, what's important for them and what we can get working for the individuals. But the majority of people are looking at their hands and arm function. So apart from contractures, what else is causing problems? Now, contractures is undoubtedly the biggest on top of weakness. And how weak is weak? We measure power, or it's actually force, on a scale of 0 to 5, where 0 is nothing at all, absolutely nothing. In effect, it is paralysis. 0 equals paralysis. There is no movement. And a grade 1 is what we call a flicker. It doesn't move anything anywhere, but it's a twitch. And that means the muscle is working. It doesn't have to move you for miles. It's not going to make a big movement. But if it's enough just to twitch the muscle, if you can feel a little twitch, a tiny, tiny little twitch, and we feel that sometimes, I can get the kids to twitch a muscle, even though it doesn't move, then that muscle has at least a grade 1 and is switching on and can be worked with. Is there any way we can get from 0 to a flicker? There are several ways and we will talk about them. And after we've looked at 0 and grade 1, which is a flicker, we want some movement. And that's what people are asking for, movement, particularly of fingers, wrists, arms, possibly shoulders, but mainly functional movement. We can look at different ways of doing it, but again, you have to pick what's important for you. Set yourself goals. Don't set too many goals. Start little. This is the important thing. If you have a lot of weakness, if your child or your spouse or the person you look after has a lot of weakness, don't go for everything all at once, because you'll get very frustrated and it'll be quite difficult. But you need to think about what's important to you. I can't tell you that. Nobody else can tell you that. You have to think what's important to you or your child. We need to think about sensation, and most people with SMA have totally intact sensation. It only affects the motor nerves. But sometimes you lose the sensation of movement. You've forgotten what movement's like. You just don't know the feeling. If you've been sat for a long time, if you have been so weak you can't do a movement, I have people who actually don't know what it feels like to do a particular movement. So it's very hard to switch on something when your brain can't actually feel what you're trying to do. So we have to think about the sort of sensory motor aspect of getting the movement. And that's where passive movement can come in. It's not ideal, but it's a good starting place. And then the last thing we have to think about is disuse atrophy. There are muscles in our bodies, all of us, everybody, that get weaker. And this is again the atrophy, same thing, but disuse atrophy basically means that the muscles aren't working just because they haven't been asked to work or made to work or been useful or strong enough to work and have just got weaker and weaker over time. And with disuse atrophy, we can improve power, but there is a limit. I cannot make a muscle stronger than it would be normally in SMA. So even when you are working really hard, if you are not on treatments yet, and even if you are, there will still be a limit to how much power your muscles can generate. Now, part of that is disease, part of that is the atrophy within the muscle, and part of that, obviously, again, is the contractures. So we need to look at what we are talking about when we're talking about switching on muscle. So let's assume we are talking about the idea that we are so weak that we are finding it very difficult to even get a twitch. And I've had several people say to me recently, my hands do nothing. And I'm not 100% convinced that they do nothing, but they certainly don't do an awful lot that's functional, because I think once you get going, you will find that there is more in there than you realize. You just aren't necessarily getting the right kickstart. So how do we kickstart in the beginning? So you have a muscle, and there are certain things we can do with some muscles that possibly we can't do with others. So let's look at the sort of things that we can do to wake up muscles. And the first one is put them through the movements. So lots of passive movement. Now, I know a lot of parents are using the inner walk. I also think a lot of them are using it passively, that the machine is doing the work. And while that's fine, that's the start. Parents saying, oh, they're doing amazing things on it. No, I'm not 100% convinced that in the early stages, in the first 3 months, the children are doing a lot. The machine is doing it for them. But that switches on the muscle. And I really do think in that respect, it can be useful, as long as it doesn't increase the contractures. And I'm not convinced about that either. However, you need to make sure that you can switch that on with passive movement. Now, some of you have got those pedals, the hand pedals, the foot pedals. And again, even if you're not doing the work, the movement involved is really important, because if it's getting those arms and legs moving, that's a positive. And one of the things I've seen with the pedals is people moving them forwards, and don't forget, you can do all the same thing backwards, and the same with the feet. So that even if the machine is doing the work, this is really, really important to start switching on these muscles, because once you are with the movement, then your brain starts getting the idea of it. And then the idea is that you start helping, so that the machine is doing all this round and round, and then off you go and you're doing it. Now, if you look at a lot of the sports therapy websites, they will talk about something called muscle memory, that muscle has a memory, that things become automatic. I am not personally convinced that my muscles have memory, or maybe I'm just too old and they've lost a lot of memory, pretty much the same as everything's going. But I do believe it's the brain that gets the memory of the movement and re-wakes up that movement. It's like something, you know, a record that you used to know 20 years ago, and somebody suddenly plays it and you think, oh, haven't heard that for a long time. Same thing with the brain and your muscles. Oh, haven't seen that working for a long time. And suddenly that little bit of your brain that connects to that muscle is switched on again. It's like any memory. You don't always remember it until something jogs your memory. You hear some music, you smell a particular smell, something switches it on. And that's the way I believe it works with movement, that suddenly a little light goes on in your brain that says, oh, yeah, I can do that. Or yeah, I know what that feels like. Or yes, I'm starting to get that. So I do think this has a value for repetitive passive movement. And it is an issue of repetitive. And this is why the inner walk and these machines work. I don't honestly think that somebody moving your leg up and down 3 or 4 times is repetitive enough to wake up that brain. It's not going to work once or twice. It's got to be done. There are what they call continuous passive motion machines. I'm not convinced this is the sort of thing that people should be going out to buy, but you really need to be moving for 5 to 10 minutes at least to sort of switch on that brain. It's no good doing 2, 3, or 4 movements, even 10, up, down, down goes the other leg. You need, firstly, to start with slow movement. There's no point in doing it too fast. You have got to start slow. And the reason you need to start slow is because if it's too fast, you can't actually start joining in with it. So you need to start slow. So that passive movement, 10 movements up and down are great. I'm not knocking them. It's not my idea of physio, but that's besides the point. But it's not really going to switch on that muscle. You have to have the opportunity to try and work with the movement and keep doing that for a while, even if you think you are too tired or there's nothing happening. You need to keep going, as I say, for about 5 to 10 minutes to try over time to try and get these muscles switched on. Now, passive movement will possibly switch your muscles on, but it won't make you move when you untie yourself. So when you get onto these machines, what you have to do is really think about working with the machine, even if there's nothing happening, because there will come a time when the machine is not doing the work and you manage a little bit of it. And this is not instant. This can take months to get those muscles working again. So we need to wake up your muscles. Another way of waking up muscles is to warm them up. So one of the nice things about swimming and hydrotherapy, particularly if it's a nice warm pool or even a bath, for those of you who still have baths, I know a lot of them get swapped out and you get wet rooms and showers and all sorts of things instead, which I know is not popular, but much easier. But if you still have a bath or a hot tub or have facilities to go to a hydro pool, it is one place where the warmth and the water will help those muscles switch on. And it is undoubtedly true that these movements in water do help, and they help you to start getting the feeling of movement and moving around. I know that the facilities for hydrotherapy in England are limited. I don't believe with COVID and with other problems they're going to get better, but for those of you who do have the opportunity to use a bath, a hot tub, or a hydrotherapy pool, make the most of it, because it is another way of switching those muscles on. So you can use warmth, you can use repetitive movement, you can use other ways of stimulating muscle. Marnie, any questions so far?
Yes, we've had quite a few.
Okay, that's what I thought we might.
You may have kind of answered as they probably asked before you said, but I'll ask them anyway, just so you can go over it again. When I try to move my arms, they don't move, but I can feel the muscle working. So does this mean it's worth doing this?
Yeah, now the big issue that we've talked about in several of the webinars is one of the biggest problems with arms and legs is that you can feel the movement, but what you can't do is lift the weight of the arm against gravity. So if you cannot lift your arm up off a table, off the arm of your wheelchair, you can feel the muscles there, but they're not moving. They're not lifting your arm. Your arm is too heavy. And we'll go back through these ideas of supported movement using Theraband, using scarves, using hoist slings. We will go through that as part of what we're doing. But the biggest issue for arms and legs is lifting the arms and legs to allow them to move. You can't get your shoulder to move very far if you can't take the weight of your own arm, but you can slide it, and that's where we should be starting. Well, we have talked about this, we'll talk about it some more.
Okay, great. How can I help my daughter's hamstring tendinitis? The tendons at her knee She has had spinal surgery and her knees are very sore. She has an appointment next week for a stander and I'm worried it will damage her legs. Any tips? She's 4 years old and type 1.
She's had spinal surgery, she's 4 years old. So she's actually a bit of a mess by the sounds of things. I think what we need to look at is several things. You say it's the hamstring tendons that are causing the pain, but it could actually be the knee joints themselves. So you need to be sure that it is actually the hamstrings. It may be that she does find it very difficult to stand in a standing frame, because if she's had spinal surgery and her knees are bent, all the pressure is going to go through her knees. So I think this is really a case of understanding exactly where the pain's coming from, knowing how bad her contractures are. I would imagine if she's type 1 and she's already had spinal surgery, she may be getting what we call a supine stander, which is one of those where you lie down and then come up to standing. I really do feel from what you're saying, if she has very painful knees, that's what they should be using for starters, is a supine stander, not standing us straight upright straight away. So as I say, you start off in the sort of lying position, you're put on the supine stander that way, and then the whole stander comes up. And that's a much, much more comfortable way of trying to stand. And I think that seems to me what should be happening for your daughter for starters. There seems to be a lot going on around her hamstrings or her knee joints that need sorting. That's not strictly part of what we're doing tonight, but it's something that we could look at, is pain and that sort of thing.
Great. How can I exercise my shoulders as they dislocate easily?
Okay, now this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because the less you exercise, the less likely they are to dislocate. And most shoulders only will dislocate in one direction. So they'll either dislocate down or backwards or forwards. So what you need to know is, which way do your shoulders dislocate? Do they tend to pop forwards? Do they tend to drop down out of the socket, or do they tend to go backwards? And that, what you need to then do is make sure the exercises you are doing are working the opposite way. And this is the problem. So you have to know where your shoulder dislocates. So then once you've established where it dislocates, if it dislocates forwards, then you have to make sure you're not going to pop your shoulder out. Think about the movements that cause it to dislocate and avoid those and work other ones, because what you need to do in a dislocating situation, people have the same with kneecaps, people have the same with other parts of bodies, but shoulders are a common one. What you need to do is make sure you avoid that movement by building up other muscles. You can do a lot of static work. You can work in a sort of sling position where you're working your shoulder girdle. And that's another one that people forget. The shoulder and the shoulder girdle work together, but can work separately. So you can work your shoulder girdle, particularly backwards and downwards. So that's your clavicle and your shoulder blade. You can work the muscles around your shoulder girdle to help support your shoulder before you start moving your shoulder. People don't think about this, and this is really important. So work your shoulder girdle. So this is your shoulder girdle. That's your shoulder joint. This is your shoulder girdle, and you can work the muscles. You've got lots of muscles around your shoulder girdle that you can be exercising before the actual shoulder joint, and those muscles could help support your shoulder when you move onto your shoulder.
Okay, great. And the parent of the little girl we were just discussing with the things is saying, how do I know if it's the knee joints or the tendons? When I massage the back of her knee, she will cry.
It's really still very hard to know what's going on. I think this is a situation where mum needs to PM me.
Okay. I've lost my place now. My son is 20 months old, weak type 2. How can I improve his trunk control and hand-arm strength?
Okay, trunk control we need to do on peanuts and balls. That's the main one. I think the other thing that we need to think about with trunk is that one of the biggest problems we have with trunk control in littlies is head control, because unless you've got good head control, you can't work your trunk. So you've got to look at head and trunk almost separately and then together. So what you need to do is first establish good head control, because if your head's wobbling all over, it's very hard to stabilize your trunk. But you can do lots of rolling work. You can do resisted rolling. You can do work on a peanut. You could do work on a ball. You can sit in different positions. So instead of trying to sit upright, you're sitting on a wedge and you're working your trunk from there to try and come forward. There's a lot you can do. I think we've even done that on a webinar, but certainly you really need, and trunks are a difficult one in littlies, but you need to think about head. You need to work on that head, stabilize that head, and then think about the trunk. But there is quite a lot you can do in terms of resisted rolling, peanut work, and head and trunk together. But lots of things. The other thing that's actually incredibly good for trunks that most physios don't appreciate is standing. And I know a lot of children, people will say, oh, well, they can't sit very well. How can you get them standing? Well, actually, the most important muscle for trunk control is often the hamstrings. Now, that sounds crazy because they are in the legs. They stabilize the pelvis and then give the trunk something to work against. When you're sitting on your bottom, you can't effectively work your hamstrings. Your hamstrings work much better in standing. So this is not standing in a standing frame. This is weight bearing against a peanut or a therapy ball, or even standing in gaiters. And it actually does make a big difference. And I wish physios would get this through their head, that children who are not very good at sitting and have rotten trunks can still do amazing work in a standing position. I can't hear you, Marnie. You've disappeared.
Sorry,
Oh.
What are good exercises for my daughter's scoliosis? She's 12 and type 2.
I think scoliosis is another whole ball game. Again, I think we need to go back to looking at switching on muscle, and that might give you some ideas about scoliosis in the same way it might give you ideas about trunk. But I think what we need to look at with scoliosis is completely different. These are not muscles that are switched on. This is more about asymmetry and deformity and what the joints of the spine are doing against gravity. And I think you can work on a scoliosis. I don't think you can cure a scoliosis, but you can certainly work a scoliosis. But I think we need to take that in the context of, again, what we're doing for the weakest muscles. And I'm not sure that we can be specific to scoliosis in this topic.
Okay, I think you kind of covered this as it was asked as you were talking about it, but I'll say it anyway. How can we make our muscles remember the lost movement? Is passive movement the only way, or is there a way to make them remember to perform functionally?
I'm afraid there is. It's called repetitive movement, repetition, keep going, lots and lots of learning. I think what we forget is that when we are little, it takes us a long time to learn movement. I mean, it takes us over a year in the normal situation to learn to walk. This is not a significant amount of time when you're 40, but a year to a 1-year-old is a lot of time. You need to learn to sit. You need to learn to roll. It takes time. It takes repetition. Think of a child's first steps, those shaky little first steps, and how long it takes to get away from those shaky first steps. Even if we're not talking SMA, we're talking normal. And in the normal situation, you've got to learn and redo it. Think about when you learned to drive, how often you had to change gear to get that memory. Think about anything that you've done. Learning to knit and not drop your stitches, repetition, 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 learning your tables. How many times did you repeat your bloomin' tables? It's all about repetition. It's doing it frequently, and it's doing it without big gaps. Do it, stop doing it for 6 weeks, and you'll have to start again. So this is one of the biggest problems we have with muscle. You exercise for 6 weeks. switch those muscles on, stop exercising for 6 weeks, they've switched off again. Repetition, keep going every day, several times a day. Don't allow fatigue to get in the way. If you're tired, don't do it. If you're not well, don't do it. The important thing is you mustn't exercise to fatigue. Little and often, but often, and plenty of it. Change. You don't have to make yourself fatigue. Do one side, do the other. Do your shoulder, do a leg if you're interested in doing your legs. I know a lot of the older type 2s aren't really that bothered about their legs. They would quite like to learn to roll. That's your legs and trunk, but that's gross movement, and that's harder and takes longer, because very often rolling is a problem with contractures as well as power. So there are a lot of things to think about, but it's often, it's little and often, it's frequent. Or do lots of different activities like crafts, like getting your hands dirty, like getting your hands in a bowl of water. I mean, adults have forgotten what it's like to be kids. Get your hands in a bowl of water. You know, the water trays and the sand trays and the play trays and all the dirty little things you like doing. Get your hands in the washing up bowl. Great stuff. You've got to get in there and get doing it.
Okay. At what degree of knee contracture can we say is really bad and we need to be concerned?
Okay, what degree of contracture? Well, that really depends on what you want to do with your knees. A knee should go from straight to bent just about up to your bottom. Okay, now the only time you really need to bend up to your bottom is when you're sitting on your knees. It is very rare to actually spend much time with your knees up to your bottom. So if you sit on your knees, and that's true of children, you don't need that range of movement. But it's not the amount of bend that's important. It's the amount of straighten that's important. Let me see if I can just plonk something behind my iPad for a second to bring this forward. See if that's going to work without sending it crashing. No, it's not. Never mind. We'll see. There we go. That's better. Okay. So you've got straight knees. You need straight knees ideally to stand, and certainly to walk. It is very hard to walk with bent knees. It's not hard to stand with bent knees, but usually it means standing in a standing frame. If we are talking about the knees going straight, what happens with some children is they go over straight. So if this is your bottom and this is facing forwards, their knees will go over straight. The reason they often go over straight is because of tight ankles. So you can't take knee contractures and knee tightness on their own, because there are muscles that go over the knee joint that also go over the ankle. And there are muscles that go over the knee that also go across the hip. So you cannot take a knee in isolation. It's very rare to have tightness at the knee and absolutely nowhere else. And what degree of contracture is a problem? Any degree of contracture is a problem, but it depends how old you are, how contracted you are, what you want to do, what you can't do, and how much those muscles still have room to work. So if when you are sitting, your leg is stuck at 90 degrees, and when you lie down, it's still stuck at 90 degrees, and it won't straighten out, there's not a lot you're going to do with that knee. So that you need to think, what degree of contracture and what am I going to achieve? When children are small, we would say any degree of contracture is a problem, but you will get contractures. Nobody's going to stop them. We just try and minimize them. But it really depends what you're thinking about. If you've got 90-degree contracture, and they do exist, 90 degrees, they're not common. It's usually around 50, 60 degrees. But if you've got 90 degrees of contracture, what are you going to try? Because there's not an awful lot this muscle at the top, your quadriceps, is going to achieve in terms of straightening you up when your knee is that far stretched and tight. So The size of the contracture is not the issue. It's a case of what you want to be able to do and what movement you can still achieve.
Okay, I'm just going to jump a question because this is really long, and I don't want to have to write it all. I'm 44 years old on treatment. I managed to make a minimum movement in my finger. I couldn't move for many years, but it means it's also developed a contracture. How many times a day should muscles be trained to avoid developing contractures? Can you do too much? And then they've also asked, the second question is, are using like supplements, sport shakes, like protein shakes, helpful?
Nutrition wise, I have absolutely no idea for two reasons. I have no idea if that's going to help in terms of building up muscle. Certainly, most sports people will say that protein shakes help and protein stuff does help. I certainly don't think it's going to do any harm. How much it'll build up is hard to know. So the protein shakes, as I say, not going to do you any harm. Beware they're not too fatty. And some people's guts aren't that hot taking very hefty protein shakes. So be careful when you start with protein shakes that you don't overdo it and suddenly think that the more you take, the more it's going to work. So if there are instructions about how much you should take per day, I would stick to that, because otherwise you're really going to have an upset stomach. So protein shakes, one way or another, I don't know what proof there is in SMA. I would have to look that up, which I will do, but I don't think at this point in time we have any real idea how that would work in terms of supplementing the treatment that you're on, which I'm assuming if you're 44 is Risdiplam. Whether Roche would give out that information, I don't know, because I don't suppose Roche have even thought about it, to be honest. Now, in terms of the contracture, what you don't say is, was the contracture there before your muscles started being switched on, which I have a sneaky feeling it probably was. But we do have to beware, and we know this from the small children. One of the biggest problems that we've had with nusinersen, we can't say as much in the UK with Risdiplam because we don't have enough people on it, but for definite on nusinersen, by getting stronger, they have increased their contractures. And that goes absolutely without saying, because while many of our type 1s in the past did not survive, what they didn't have was the contractures that we're seeing now in type 1. I have seen many, many children over the years pre-treatment. When I say pre-treatment, before treatments became available. So I had 25 years plus of seeing type 1 babies, even type 1As, type 1Cs, good type 1s. And they didn't really get a lot of contractures because there was virtually no muscle imbalance. So although they had weakness at the front of the hips and the back of the hips, if you're weak in both areas, you're not going to get the contractures. So certainly pre-treatments, we were not seeing the level of contractures we're seeing now. We had many children who lived over the age of 2, although people will say, oh, nobody survived. They did. We had 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, and the most common contracture was contractures of the feet. But I had a little boy who was well over 2 years old, who had very, very few contractures because he was weak everywhere, but strong enough not to, at that point, have had a chest infection. Unfortunately, he did succumb to a chest infection in the end, but he was very, very little in the way of contractures. And that's what we saw. The older children tended mostly to get contracted feet because they were hanging down a lot, because they didn't in those days stand very much. It wasn't thought useful to stand a type 1, so they used to get very contracted feet, but not so much in other areas. The biggest problem with contractures, as I say, is these treatments will not cure contractures. They may make them worse. If you do not have contractures now, if you have a finger that is not contracted and you start being able to bend it and it's much harder to straighten it, then the possibility is you may get some tightness at these joints. Same with your wrist, same with your elbow, same with your hips, same with your knees, same with your feet. If you can suddenly push your foot down that you weren't doing before, then you might end up getting a stuck foot that you didn't have before. So yes, you need to be aware, but what you also need to be aware of is where your contractures are now, and making sure that the movement that you are gaining, somebody is helping you to move both ways, so that if you had very little movement in your finger and it suddenly started doing that, that somebody works with you to do that as well. And that's really important. Same with the wrists. If we do a lot of that with the wrists and not very much of that, then we're going to end up with a wrist that gets tight down there. And that's not very helpful when you try and straighten your fingers out.
Okay. How can I help improve my daughter's neck control?
Well, that's really depends on lots of factors, but you know, it's going back to what we said many times. One of my favorite ways of working is something called PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. You don't have to remember all that. Everybody knows it as PNF. And the most important way of doing that is to work in small ranges with lots and lots and lots of static movement. And when we talk about static, I always say the same thing. I'm very boring. Sometimes I'm going to have to think of some new analogies. Is the broken down bus. If you were to try and push a broken down bus, you wouldn't move it an inch, but you would still be working really hard. When you try and push something incredibly heavy, you're pushing. You may not make any movement at all, but your muscles will know it. You'll start getting sweaty, you'll breathe harder. So you know you're working, and that's static movement. It doesn't produce a movement, it's static muscle work. And that's how we work heads. Pushing back into the headrest, pushing back into the pillow, pushing sideways into a headrest, or lying on your side and pushing into a pillow, lying on the other side and pushing into a pillow. And the one where we say what you do is you put a hand on the side of the face and say, don't let me push you, don't let me push you, don't let me pull you, don't dislocate their jaw, don't let me push you, don't let me pull you, hold it there, hold it there. Lots and lots of PNF. You can do it in side lying, you can do it in sitting, you can do it in lying. That's the way to do it. And we have seen it. We have seen improved head control. The very first time, many years ago, don't know if this young man ever tunes in, I've never come across him, lived in Essex. And he used to sit like this all the time. He'd have his head propped on one hand. And when they were talking about spinal surgery, the spinal surgeon said to him, maybe we should do your neck as well, because, you know, you constantly got your hand there. And if we do your neck as well, then that'll free up a hand. Because if you're like this all the time, and I know there's lots of people out there that do this, sit there with their head propped up when you get tired. And he said, no, don't want my neck fused. Absolutely not. Mum said, absolutely not. So we set up a program of PNF that Mum and he did religiously for 3 to 4 months. And he came back to clinic, and he's in clinic talking to the doctor, and he doesn't have his head propped on his hand for 20 minutes. And we both said to this doctor, you haven't even noticed that he's not propping his head up. And it really did make a big difference. But you have to, like everything else, put the effort in to get the work out, to get the results. But he worked really hard, and he wasn't a strong type 2. He was quite a bendy type 2, which could have a negative effect. Being bendy isn't always positive, because muscles that work over bendy joints actually have to be stronger, not weaker. It's not an advantage. It's an advantage in terms of contractures, but it's not an advantage in terms of movement. He was quite bendy, really had quite a lot of trouble with his head and neck. But the PNF made a big difference. Now, the big problem that we had was, once you start a program like that, he had to keep going with it, because particularly if he'd had spinal surgery, then he has to keep his head stable. And what a lot of people find is they lose a lot of head stability post-spinal surgery, because your head's in a strange position when your back's being changed. And so you really do need to do a lot of work on that head. And PNF is my favorite way of working that head. I don't think there are many ways other than PNF that you can work the head.
Okay. My daughter, type 1, stands with AFOs and walks with them too. Should she also try walking without them? Because when she does, she gets her foot in the wrong position.
If she's getting her foot in the wrong position when she tries to work without them, absolutely not. But what you may find is that the AFOs, and I just happen to have one sitting beside me. Here we are. That's a bit impressive, isn't it? I have my little bag of tricks that I now keep beside me when I do these webinars. This is an AFO, and what you may find would be helpful for her is this has what we call a long foot. So that this is the AFO, comes up the leg, and it's got a long foot. This comes past the end of the toes at the front here. Now, what might make it easier for her, and it's really hard to persuade people this works, but it does, is to have what we call a short foot, so that it's cut off just, not a foot, the AFO is cut off just about behind what we call the metatarsal heads, which is just when the arch of her foot stops, so that not just the toes, but the next set of bones, you know, you're always hearing about footballers breaking their fifth met head or whatever. So it's the metatarsal, it's the bone. The equivalent is these bones in the hand. So these are the equivalent of your toes. It's these bones. So where you want the AFO to finish is just behind those, and it should be smoothed downwards so that she doesn't really feel it. And that allows a more rolling gait, but still controls the ankle. The alternative is what we call SMAFOs. And I don't know if I have a SMAFO in my little box of tricks, but that's the alternative. And that's known as a supramalleolar orthosis, and that controls the wobble of the foot around the ankle and hind foot. And it may be that a SMAFO, if she really is that good, is more appropriate, and you need to discuss that with your physio and your orthotist, whether she either has a short forefoot on the AFO or whether she goes to SMAFOs to control the ankle and the hind foot better, because sometimes AFOs do not control the heel, and the heel still rolls, and what you get is that foot rolling inwards even inside the AFO.
Okay. Do you advise physio for a child not on treatment?
That's an interesting one, because just think that we always had physio for children before these treatments were there. So I'm not sure why anybody would consider not treating a child, whether they were or they weren't on treatment. I find that a very strange question, because we treated children. I mean, I've been doing this 32 years. And how long have these treatments been around? 3 or 4 years. So yeah, we were doing this for 20 odd years. I was doing it. Lots of people were doing it before me. Not many around now, but there were. And yeah, I mean, absolutely. Every child should be having physio, whether they're on treatments or not. And many, many years ago, I turned around to Victor Dubovitz, who some of you will have heard of. His name isn't quite as well known these days. I turned around to Victor Dubovitz and said, how do you know physiotherapy works? And his answer to me has always stuck with me. And he said, just look at the children who never get any. And that is so incredibly true, that they will have scoliosis earlier, they will be contracted earlier, they will have stuck heads, they will be less functional, they will be less comfortable. So yes, I mean, the answer to that is just yes, there's no other answer.
Okay. Have you heard of the movement lessons where you use soft touch or a laser light to wake up the muscles? Do you think this would be effective in SMA?
I certainly don't think a laser light will do absolutely anything. I'm not sure what a laser is supposed to do to wake up a muscle. There are many things that we were going to talk about, which we haven't got to yet. I don't know how many more questions we've got, but maybe if we move on a little bit and I talk about those things, the other things to wake up the muscles, then that might answer some more questions, Marnie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'm going to talk about tape, ice and sensory input. I'm going to talk about vibration, and I'm going to talk about electrical stimulation. And that might cover a few questions. So I'm going to move on. Now, the first one is tape. And we've had tape webinars. You can go back and see the tape webinar. I know somebody suggested we do it again, and we can do it again, but we have done it. It is there, but I'm quite happy to look at doing it again. It really does work for hands. We know it works for hands. We have seen it for many children we have put, and young people. I don't think I've ever used it on an adult. And I'm going to do it now and show you, as a lot of people will do it anyway, how I would cut tape for a hand. Now, if I was doing 4 fingers and not doing the thumb, which I often do, it needs to come way down onto the wrist and up the forearm. And as I was talking to Marnie before we came on air, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the muscles to the fingers and the wrist are here. They're not in the hand. There are muscles in the palm, on this side of the palm and on this side of the palm. Now that control, all these control the thumb. And many people in SMA are very flat here and here. And that shows that the grip, that is weak here and here. And you can stimulate those, and we'll talk about that. But you can't stimulate anything if you're not going to work with it. All this needs work as well. The other place you have muscles is here in between your fingers, and they open your fingers and close your fingers. And that's something a lot of people find very difficult. And that's something you can do on a slidey surface with a glove on. If your hands are sweaty and you find that difficult, it might be easier to start with a glove. I know when you have sweaty, difficult hands, it's hard to get a glove on. So just cover them in talcum powder and stick them on a shiny surface. And the other strange movement is that one, which a lot of people find quite difficult as well, keeping those fingers flat but bent at your knuckles. And these are movements that happen in the hand, but your wrist movements and your bend and straighten actually come from tendons in your forearm. So when you're doing this, you need to put the tape all the way down your forearm. And when you're doing your fingers, what you want to do is basically cut this tape in 4. So you've got 1 strip for each finger and a pretty even 4. Now, without going into a whole taping lesson, we round off our edges, which some very good people remember. And the reason we do that is because it sticks better and doesn't curl up at the edges. So each one gets, just be thankful you're not an octopus. And what we basically end up with a little hand-shaped thing like this. And what we do is we tape that across the back of the hand. It should be much longer than this, but I need to be able to show you. You tear your tape. Hope you're watching this, Marnie. You tear your tape at the bottom of the finger bits so that each one's individual. You stick the first bit of your tape on up the back of your wrist. That goes on there. It should come all the way down. And then you peel that up your hand, or you get somebody to do it for you. And then you tape your individual fingers with the 4 pieces. And it wants to come all the way up to your nail. And it does work. It really does work for helping you extend. Now I can feel that pulling this finger up, just what it's done here. And when I pull down, it wants to pull it back up again. So it does work. We know it works. We've done it on a lot of people and it really works well. As I pull that finger down, the tape wants to pull it back up again. And the important thing is not how well or otherwise you do the tape. But if you feel that that tape is working, work with it. Work with it. It does make a difference. But that really does work. And we do that quite a lot with people who get stuck down fingers and can't straighten them. And that's a really nice, easy tape to do once you get used to it. Okay, so tape works. You can tape wrists. Can you tape, and this is a big OT one, can you tape a hand so that it'll turn over? Not if it won't go there. You can't tape a contracture and make the contracture go away. So this movement, palm up, is called supination. And you can tape the muscle that does a lot of the supination. They're all forearm muscles. And what you need to do is tape in a spiral. And if you have the movement there, if it can be passively moved, you may be able to tape it to assist the movement. But if the movement is not there, no amount of tape is going to make it work. We tape feet, we tape ankles, but not for the same reason. The most success we've had with SMA for switching on movement have been hands, and surprisingly the quadriceps muscle, the knee muscle. And you do a big Y tape over the knee muscle, and that can help switch on the knee muscle. Now, in other conditions, we've used them for switching the neck muscles on up the back of the neck. We've used them for switching my shoulder muscles, so that if you're very hunched, we've been able to switch on shoulders. We've been able to switch on that movement of bringing your shoulders back, not just your shoulder girdle, but shoulder. So there are things that we can do with taping for definite. We know they work in other conditions. There's no reason why they shouldn't work in SMA. But taping won't cure. You can't go on forever. We know you can tape up the back of the neck to help get the head up. I have to say, one of the problems with taping up the back of the neck is if you have hair down the back of your neck, you are going to have to shave it, whether it's a child or an adult. Now, there was a time when you could come to a physio who did taping and she would shave it for you. Now we're not allowed to. So if you're hairy and you're going to your physio for some taping, you'll have to get somebody else to shave it for you, a member of your family, which is just one of the things that we're not allowed to do now. But if you want to try up the back of the neck, you want to try shoulders, lady with the dislocating shoulders, you could try taping your shoulder when you exercise to try and support it, stop it dislocating. It won't work completely, but it'll give it a little bit of support. For definite, there are taping techniques for dislocating shoulders, but those are acute dislocating shoulders. What you have is chronic dislocating shoulders. In other words, they're constantly doing it. This is not a single injury that's dislocated it, but you can tape for dislocated shoulders. So taping is something that, again, is a whole webinar and we can't really go through. And I'm not going to stop here because I know we're going to get lots of questions on this section. So the next one is more a sensory one. Somebody talked about sensory input, and sensory, yes, the fact that you're blasting lasers at it, I'm not sure, but we do use sensation, and you can use ice, and it's what we call brushing. And you can get an ice cube, look up where the muscle belly is. It's no good just doing your hand and expecting your hand. You're supposed to be trying to stimulate the muscle belly. That's what you want to work. The tendon is just the attachment of the muscle to the bone. So stimulating a tendon doesn't have a sensory supply or very much of a blood supply. You need to stimulate muscle if you're doing sensory. So you need to find out where that muscle is. It's very easy to look up muscles online. Think about the movement. Is it wrist extension? Just put in wrist extensors. It'll show you where the muscles are. They're all over the place on Google, on Wikipedia, you name it. Brush the muscle. Now you can brush it with an ice cube. You can brush it with a toothbrush. It's not a nice sensation, but it's not supposed to be. So it's actually stimulating the muscle through sensory. You won't get that sort of movement with the creams that are supposed to go all nice and warm. It really has to be almost what we call a noxious stimulus, something that's actually not that nice. So ice, brushing, we do something called tapping to try and wake up these muscles. So there are sensory things you can do. How much they work is another matter. The next one is vibration, and there is talk that vibration can improve muscle. And there are vibrating plates. Now, are you going to go out and get a vibrating plate to stick your hand on? Well, I don't think you need to. I think you could get an electric toothbrush, and actually it is quite a positive sensation. Whether it will help you to get a movement is a different matter, but don't go out and buy lots of vibrating plates. Get your electric toothbrush out and see if you can stimulate a bit of muscle with that. And then the last thing that people ask a lot about is electrical stimulation. And that's basically having 2 pads, electric current. And what you've got is you've got an electric current at one part of the muscle, electric current in another, because the muscles work through electricity. That's what should be coming down your nerves, and it will make a twitch. And in some cases, it can make a complete contraction. Now, most adults don't mind electrical stimulation. I actually hate it. I do not like the sensation. And when we used to do a lot of electrical stimulation, you had to test the current. And I used to be like that to test it, which was never really gave a lot of confidence to my patients. But I just didn't like the sensation. And it starts off as a little tingle, and then you get this twitch. I find it quite unpleasant, but if it's done well, you can get electrical stimulation. It's being used more and more. Do not go and buy the kits off the internet without somebody to explain how it's meant to be done, which muscles you want to do, and exactly how you use it, because you don't just plonk the electrodes on. You've got to try and get a particular point, ideally on the muscle, where you will get the best result. So it's not just a case of finding a muscle and plonking electrodes on and switching yourself on. The other thing is, what you have to think about is you have to learn to work with the current. So if you've got electrical stimulation that's pulling your wrist up, you have to learn to work with it. In other words, when you switch the machine off, you have to try and keep that movement. Now, one of the things I've seen on the internet about exercise is this pull, 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 push, 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 push. It doesn't do enough. Repetitive is one thing, but holding it. So if you're doing an exercise where you're pulling, it's not just pull, pull, pull. It's pull and hold, pull and hold, pull and hold. And it's really, really important. You can pull a little bit and hold there, and pull a lot and hold there. Those are totally different parts of the muscle in different parts of the movement. We move in ranges. So if I'm pulling a handle, an exercise band here, what I am doing here is working a different part of the muscle to what I am doing here. So you need to pull and hold. If you've got a Theraband tied to the door and you're just going pull, 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 that's not going to work very well. You need to pull and hold. That's what's really working the muscle. Pull and hold and slowly release. Pull and hold. So that there are lots and lots of things, but electrical stimulation as well, you need to be able to try and reproduce that movement when you switch it off. Now, as I say, what you tend to do is you start with just a tingle. That tingle then is increased to a twitch, and then the twitch becomes a movement. But you can't rely on the electrical stimulation just to suddenly get you up and moving every muscle. You imagine the bigger muscles need more current, so you do have to have a fairly strong bit of current. I'm not talking about switching yourself in a plug on the wall, but these machines need to be able to generate a reasonable amount of current to actually move a knee or pull a foot up. And as I say, you really do need somebody working with you on this to make sure you're doing the right muscles and getting the right part of the muscle to get the best possible twitch. Okay, so what I wanted to do was go through those 4 ideas, Marnie, because I thought that would generate quite a lot more questions. Gosh, have we already got to 8:05?
Yeah, it's flown, hasn't it? Yeah, there's been quite a few questions.
Well, that's why I wanted to get through those 4 ideas.
Yeah, a lot of them were about the electronic muscle stimulation. We've had a few people asking about them and just if you'd recommend it.
I do recommend it. I do think that it can be helpful if you really are having a lot of difficulty stimulating muscle. I think it's obviously you're going to try other things first, but if it really doesn't work and you're keen, yes, if you have a physio, and I know it's easy to say that, but adults, if you do have a neuromuscular service and there is a physio with that neuromuscular service, I know there's some amazing physios in adult neuro, and they are some of the best people at electrical stimulation. We did have a physio working with us at Great Ormond Street. Unfortunately, she left recently. I'm still in touch with her because we had parents who were asking about electrical stimulation. I really do see that there's a value in it. I have been convinced. I wasn't 100% sure because parents were expecting it to do ridiculous things. As I say, you don't just plug yourself in at the wall and off you go. I know there are walking orthotics, you know, these electronic-y, roboty things that are all based around electrical work. My honest feeling is, firstly, those things are horrifically, enormously weighty and expensive. And I worked with those when they were first introduced into the UK nearly 40 years ago, and they're cumbersome and they take a long time to put on and they're not practical. Irrespective of what people say, oh, it looks a brilliant idea. Yeah, it would be great if it was like a onesie and you just slipped it on and switch yourself on and off you went, but it's not quite that simple yet. But I do think in certain cases, if you can find a really good functional use, then electrical stimulation will work. But as I say, it's no good just going on the internet and buying something without having somebody who can support you in how to get it working and do it right, because otherwise it's another thing that'll go on the shelf in the cupboard and never be seen again. But if you use it well, if you work with it, if you're getting it in the right part of the muscle, because you can't just, as I say, plonk it on a muscle and expect it to work. It's got to be in the right part of the muscle, and then you will get a use out of it. Yes, I do think it works. Absolutely.
Okay. Someone commented, you might know what this is, saying we have a complex NMES. And what is the option?
Neuromuscular electrical stimulation. Yeah, it's just a machine that it's just one brand of machine by the sounds of things.
Okay, and they're asking what the optimum setting would be.
No idea. I don't know what muscle we're talking about. I don't know what the settings of that machine are. I don't know if it's a 4 or a 2 port machine. I really could not tell you because it's got to be individual. As I say, what you need to do, firstly, is get it in the right part of the muscle. You can have 2 electrodes or 4 electrodes. Some people work with 4, some people work with 2, but for hands, the muscles in the forearm are relatively small and you need to catch the right muscle. So I wouldn't have thought you'd use with 4 electrodes. So obviously what you've got is 2 ports. You've got a port where you've got 1 port going in with 2 wires coming out to your 2 electrodes. So you can be doing 2 at the time, basically, not 2 arms and legs, but 2 lots of electrodes. And the problem then is, as I say, the muscles of the arm there's quite a lot packed into the forearm and you need to pick up the right muscle. So you may only want to use 1. The other thing is the size of the pads. Some of them are adjustable. You can cut them to size. Some of them aren't. They are stick on. You need to be careful. We're back to the idea of sticky. People who are allergic will often be allergic to the sticky. So you need to be careful that you get hypoallergenic pads because they do stick on. It's like the only thing I can think of is a defibrillator, but that doesn't really, hopefully you'd never need to use one of those. But it's really quite important. The pads have to be stuck on quite well. Sometimes they give you a gel to put underneath it to make sure there's no air underneath it. It's got to have a really good contact with the skin under the electrodes, and you can get either a gel or sticky pads. Now, I prefer the gel because I think the sticky is, and then you have to get it off and you get all these wusses that, you know, you take one hair out and they don't want to use it again. But be careful with that. So that's the start. Are they adjustable? Do you end up with two great big pads like that on a tiny little arm? So to be perfectly honest, I have no idea what the settings are. Usually you can, it usually has a button that you can turn up the amount of force. The other thing you have to think of, there is different waves. And this sounds a bit crazy, but if you think about an electrical current, you can have constant, you can have build up and down, build up and down. You can have this constant little bzzz or woo, woo, and then you can get it up and stop, up and stop. So there are different patterns of the electrical current. There is different intensity. There is different wavelengths. So it short, sharp. So it really depends on the machine. So there could be many different factors. And while I could look that particular machine up, it won't be able to tell me what I need for each individual. That's why you really need somebody supporting you if you're going to buy one of these things.
Okay. You've kind of covered it when speaking about it, but is the electronic muscle stimulation appropriate for like children as well as adults?
If they can tolerate it, yes. Some children may have had an EMG where they test the electrical properties of the muscle, where they actually run a little current through them. A lot of children don't like it. It's very much dependent on the child. It doesn't hurt. Well, it certainly shouldn't if you turn it up slowly and get a reaction. But some children just don't like the sensation. Some adults don't like the sensation. I don't like the sensation. That's just me. I never really used to enjoy using it because while I'm happy to put it on somebody, I never liked to test it. I just didn't like it. That was just me. So it's appropriate for children, but you have to think, try it on yourself first and see what it feels like, because you've got to persuade them to keep it on. I know for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there was a guy in the States selling an electrical stimulation machine for $40,000 that a couple of our parents went to get. And the kids were fine with it. It was a ridiculous amount of money. He was a total con artist. But as I say, the kids were fine with it. Didn't really mind at all.
Okay. Someone's asking whether you recommend magnetotherapy.
I don't know what magnetotherapy is. I must be honest. It doesn't sound to me like anything. I'm not saying I'm a world expert in absolutely everything that's out there, but I get the feeling that a colleague or somebody would have talked about it. I've never heard of magnetotherapy. It doesn't seem to me something that is related to what we're talking about. Sounds something more like arthritis, where people wear magnets to stop arthritis. I'm certainly happy to look it up and see what the physiological basis is and see whether we can work out any idea of whether it could be useful, but I've never heard of it.
Okay. Someone's just a quick question about tapes is any tips on how to remove it without it being painful, and how long should you leave it on for?
The easiest way, there are several ways of removing it out without being painful. And the first one is to soak it off in water. Now, I know we say that it will stay on in water and it'll certainly stay on in a shower, but it is easier to remove generally in water. The other thing is rolling it. The idea is when you are taking tape off, you never, ever, ever, even though I did, because I wasn't treating myself, you never just go whoosh. because you will take the top layer of skin off. And if you are taping again and again, you will set up an irritation just from removing it too quickly. You literally, and I don't know if you can see this on here, you literally have to roll it. Now, there are several plaster removers that I know you use in hospital. You could run behind it with tea tree oil. That will help to remove the stickiness. But as I say, if you really want it off and you've got somebody who is absolutely worried about it, stick it in water is probably the easiest way, and soak it off.
Okay, and how long can you leave the tape on for?
Until it drops off. The last time I taped myself, I think I'm getting to be one of my best customers. I sprained my ankle doing something, can't remember what. And I think it stayed on by itself, showering daily. It stayed on for about 5 or 6 days. So, you know, I didn't take it off because as far as I was concerned, it was taking the swelling down from this, and I just left it there until, oh, I know what it was. I got bitten in the summer in the garden by something, and it swelled up ridiculously, and I put swelling tape on it. And I left the swelling tape on, even though the swelling had gone down, until it literally came off by itself.
Another tip I've got for removing sticky is, because my district nurse did it on the dressing that I had on, it just would not come off. It did not want to lift. Alcohol hand gel that everyone's got at the moment, a little bit of that around the edge and it'll just lift off. That really helps sticky.
Lovely. And to be perfectly honest, if you go to Lidl, they do a really nice little one with aloe vera in, which smells lovely, which I absolutely love. They don't always have the aloe vera one, but I like that one. It smells nice as well.
I got a bubblegum one from Primark and it smells.
I haven't been to Primark since before the beginning of lockdown in March.
Pre-pandemic, I've always had some in my bag even before COVID, so I always pick some up. It smells well nice. Okay. Someone's asked, basically you're on about fingers being like that and being able to train. What can you do if your fingers are stuck straight?
You can tape the other way. I have taped the other way before, so that you're taping the palm to try and get the fingers to come down. The problem we have with taping palms, several things we have problem with taping palms. It's really hard to keep the tape dry. Hands and soles, palms of the hands and soles of the feet are sweaty. I'm afraid you really do need your bottle of tea tree oil that you need to put on your palm before you put the tape on. Really helps the tape stick, but you need to keep that tape dry. You don't want to be in a washing up bowl. You don't want to be constantly washing your hands. And this is the biggest problem we have at the moment. So hand gel, all the other stuff, as Marnie's just said, hand gel will bring it off anyway. And this is the problem, but you can tape your palm to try and get bend as well. And there are other ways of getting bend. You can use splinting, you can use stimulation, you can, I do have a little packet here. I did actually mean to get this out 2 weeks ago when we were talking about hands. It's my packet of elastic bands. Excuse me, dog's been in here. Actually, dog's been very quiet tonight. My son's been very good and taken out.
But Dylan took himself on a walk earlier.
Luckily, he loves the snow. So you can actually almost splint your fingers down and try working with elastic bands. And in fact, there are several splints that have elastic bands on them. But actually splint your fingers down and see if that will work, just to bring your fingers down and work with elastic bands. See what you can do. Now, obviously, the easiest thing to do is spread your fingers with elastic bands. But if you just hold them there with an elastic band, it wants to pull up. Just see if you can then bring it down. Because one of the things is, if your fingers are stuck straight, You don't know what movement you've got when they're bent. If they passively bend, if your muscles will only straighten them, but they do actually bend, this is what I'm trying to do. So what I'm saying is stick a band on it so that it's sort of a figure of 8 type band, so that it's down there. And you may find in that position, because you're very rarely there, that you can start working against the straightening and try and work the opposite way around. So there's quite a lot you can do with elastic bands. You can try spreading your fingers with elastic bands, and we're back to static work. It may not help, but just squashing them open, just passive, you know, static work. Just trying to spread an elastic band. It may not happen, but just getting the feeling of trying to do it may be enough. So there's quite a lot you can do with a pack of elastic bands. You can tape it downwards, but the other thing I'd be very tempted to do is try and work in that position. And as I say, it's very hard to hold that position if your fingers want to go out all the time. So the other thing to do is actually, as I say, bring it into that position, either by splinting it or using elastic bands, and try and work in that little area there and see if there's any movement in that position.
Okay, we are getting a lot of questions through tonight in regards to contractures, so maybe that's a topic.
Okay, so that's 2 weeks' time, is it?
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Oh my goodness, look at the time.
Yeah,
I did think there was going to be a lot of questions tonight, and we haven't even really got to the other thing, which is building up from a twitch, which is why we need to look at as well, because what you need to do is think about the ranges of movement, but also we're back to this whole idea that, you know, when we started, I said that the power is measured, or force is measured from 0, which is absolutely nothing. 5 is normal, but what we haven't got is really past grade 1. So how do we move from grade 1 to grade 2? And the most important thing is to think about, again, if your fingers are extremely weak and you're having difficulty lifting it up like that, then turn your hand and try wiggling it that way. Don't try and lift it against gravity. Try and lift it without gravity. Use all these sliding things. Use the whole idea that you're sliding on a shiny surface, open and close, up and down. Lots of things that you can be doing to actually, for wrists, don't try lifting your wrist up. Try sliding it backwards and forwards for starters, instead of trying to lift it. So again, we need to move from twitch to what we call a grade 2, which is a gravity eliminated movement. In other words, not against gravity. And you need to think of what positions are gravity eliminated. So it's anything where you're not working against gravity. So if it means turning, now then some of you will say, oh, well, I can't turn. But then you have to turn your whole arm, or find a way of turning that'll change the position of your hand, your fingers, your wrist, your elbow, your foot, your head, your trunk. You need to try different positions of your hand. So it's not all about working in this position, but about working in this position as well, doing different things. Get in your bowl of water, splish splashing under the water. Get those hands in warm water and do things under there. Get your sponges in there, do other things. There's those really nice beads that they use in vases to stick flowers in, that you put them in water and they all swell up. Everybody had them for a while. Do you remember? Yeah. Those I've got some somewhere where you stick them in water. The sensation of those is fabulous. Get working on those in water. I'm not even sure where you would get them these days. I'm sure we'll find them on the internet somewhere. Need to find them. I've got a couple of packets. I need to get them out and get some more. Those are fab in water. So get your hands in a bowl of water and start sticking them in those funny squishy beads, lifting them up, wiggling through them. That would be a really nice little exercise to do. And the beauty of that is use boiled water. because otherwise they grow green stuff. If you leave them in normal water, if you put them in boiled water and let them, not boiling when you put them in, but cooled boiled water, and then let them swell, you can keep them in a sealed container and they'll be lovely for ages. But tap water will go green eventually, so don't use tap water. Don't look like that. You can use filtered water, whatever,
No,
but it's like any tap water. Eventually you leave it somewhere and it'll go green in the light, particularly in the light. So if you're going to stick them in something, stick them in something dark, like a dark plastic container, because the green will grow in the light, but it won't grow in the dark.
Okay. Someone just asked what's the best way to use a Theraband to take the weight off your arm?
Okay, so one of the things that we have seen very successfully done, which I suggested, is using the bar of a slit of your hoist. And basically what you can do is literally tie the band. It doesn't have to be Theraband. It can be a scarf. It can be something else. Literally tie it, but it has to be up there somewhere. So it's very hard to be a door. It can be somebody just above you holding it. Or even there, it doesn't have to be way up here, but if you can tie it there so that some poor carer or spouse or parent is not holding it the whole time. And it's not only that it'll take the weight and allow you to move it, but then you actually have the stretchiness, if it is Theraband, of doing some exercise with it. And if you can wrap it around your hand, you can do different stuff with it, all while the weight of your arm is being taken. But it ideally needs to be somewhere higher than your arm, so that the bar of a hoist sling is perfect.
Okay, my dad's.
And if it's a baby, then a baby gym. Very often the baby gyms are great for that. So that if you have a baby gym for littlies, get them under a baby gym and tie the bands onto the baby gym.
It does take some practice. Well, me and my dad were tying it on my hoist the other day, and he ended up just holding it, because my hoist is one of those, it's a tracking one, and it's on like a fabric band, so it's really flimsy, so it just doesn't stay still. So it does take some practice, like be prepared to have to do.
Yeah, but if it's one of those proper bars,
yeah.
If it's one of the more fixed bars, it's
Yeah.
a perfect place for doing it. Otherwise, you have to go back to the drawing board and think of something that you can have overhead. Some people will have the monkey bars, monkey poles over their bed to help them sit up, and you can do it there, but it's quite difficult. It's really nice just to have it, but it is like your dad hanging on to yours, Marnie, but it gets tiring for the person working with you.
Yeah,
good exercise for them too.
Yeah, I just had to switch arms every now and then. I keep losing, there's so many questions tonight, so if I have missed any, I do apologize. It's moving so quickly on comments. It is being recorded, you can watch it back, because someone's just asked that.
The other thing is with the questions, Marnie, if there's lots, send them to me and we can answer them at the beginning of the next one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Someone just asked, are vibrating plates for standing a good idea for type 3?
We aren't 100% sure about the value of vibrating plates just static. The idea of a vibrating plate, if you're not exercising on it, is to improve bone health. And the work that came out of Australia, which was where a lot of the work's been done on vibrating plates, suggested, and this was done by endocrinologists, who are the bone health people, apart from everything else, is that people think that standing is good for bone health, but it's actually vibration. And when you take a step, as your heel hits the ground, you set up a vibration that goes up your leg and up through your spine. And this is what's supposed to be good for your bone health. So the vibration, not just static standing. So then vibration, it was thought that if you were in a standing frame, having a vibrating plate would be useful. But vibrating machines have been in gyms for quite a long time. And the idea is that if you exercise on a vibrating machine, it will improve the work of your muscles. And this could indeed be true. I was fascinated by this whole idea and used to try it in the gym and found it, again, quite a strange sensation, and I wasn't convinced. But what it does do is it destabilizes you. You can have it on quite a shake, and it destabilizes you, and you have to work just to keep yourself stable. So yes, there are, and it probably works on a static muscle level, but you can do squats on them, you can do single leg squats on them. So, but it's no good just standing on the plate and thinking that somehow this is going to strengthen your muscle. You have actually got to work with it, so that if you want to get stability from it, you've got to be in a position where you're fairly unstable. There's no point in being on a vibrating plate and holding on for dear life with your hands, because yes, that would be an arm exercise, but I'm not sure it's doing a lot for your legs. So if you're on a vibrating plate and you're fairly stable, then you're not going to get that static muscle work to keep you stable. So you've got to think about how you're going to use vibrating plates. But I'm sure if you can work against the vibration by being in an unstable position, by, it's like wobble boards, pretty much similar, trying to keep static, trying to keep your balance, trying to work in a way. And I'm sure that the vibrating plates came originally from the wobble boards, because this is where we got to first, was actually trying to stabilize, excuse me, on a wobble board. Hang on while I have a drink. So yes, but again, like with all these things, if you're doing it passively, you're not going to learn very much in your muscles. Yeah. Oh. I think we'd better wrap this one up as the last question, Marnie.
Yeah, I'll ask this one and then we'll wrap up. 7-month-old type 1 gene therapy. Head control is coming along well. When is the best time to start exercising and getting her to practice sitting in order to avoid her back curving?
Well, getting her sitting is not going to avoid her back curving, because basically scoliosis is the problem of sitting against gravity. But she should be working on her trunk already and her stability at 7 months, because 7 months is the normal age for sitting. So what you need to be thinking about is, again, as we were talking about, you start with supported sitting, so that you've got her in a seating system. I'm not sure what country we're talking about. If it was me and she was developing head control, I'd probably want her in a squiggles system or something similar. And the squiggles is the one with all the pieces that you can move them around, and you can give her more support and you can give her less support. And then you can take away some of the support from her trunk. But yes, you're not going to stop the scoliosis by either starting her sitting later or starting her sitting earlier. At 7 months, I'd be wanting to make sure that head is good, sitting her, trying to get a little bit of work on that trunk, and also then working that idea of sitting at different angles, so that she's flat, she's up a bit, she's up a bit, she's up a bit, and getting that trunk working. A lot of work on rolling, because rolling works the trunk, resisted rolling, making it fun. Work on the pelvis as well, because trunk on pelvis is still an important idea. And if she has a very progressive physio, you could try even a supine stander at 7 months.
They have to ask another part of the question, which is when's best to start weight bearing as well?
What, for a child?
Yeah.
Well, we do it from babies. As soon as we get our little SMA ones, we put them on a therapy ball. And what I will do is bring their feet down, because with a normal baby, what you do is you start bouncing them from a couple of months old. 3 months, 4 months, you start bouncing them, you stick them in the bouncers. But it's not unusual to pick a baby up and put their feet down and bounce them around. So we like to start weight bearing through the feet, or bringing the feet down on from really quite tiny and putting a little bit of weight through the feet. And that stimulates sensation all the way up and can help to switch muscles on as well.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll leave it there.
Lovely.
We do have, which we want to give a cheeky plug, is our new community physio exercise tips and ideas Facebook group, which Marion is also in. So if you're not already a part of that, please do join. The community get to share what they've been up to, exercising and physio, and any tips that they've found helps. If you do request to join, please do answer the membership questions so that we can accept you, because if you don't answer the questions, you won't be accepted. But yeah, thank you, Marion.
Okay, we will see what more questions we need to answer, Marnie. And as you say, contractures, scoliosis, and sort of progressing from basic movement onto more resisted movement is probably where we need to go next time.
Yeah, sounds good.
Lovely. See you then, Marnie. Thanks a million. As ever, take care. Bye.